Well, happy Monday. Thank you for having me. I know that this is always a very difficult time slot because everyone is probably very looking forward to lunch right now. So bear with me. I promise to give you the answer to life, the universe, and everything at the end. So spoiler alert. This is really a story about an experiment that went completely wrong because basically it did not validate my hypothesis whatsoever. But that's always where the fun lies, isn't it? There we go. So my story begins from several years ago where I was listening to this podcast from an NPR podcast called How to Do Everything. Unfortunately, they've stopped publishing this, so I can't. There's a link to it, but it basically doesn't lead to anything. Anyways, the main takeaway from this is that I listened to this because I got pulled in not just by the small talk part, which I'm not exactly great at, but penguins, who doesn't love penguins? The interesting thing about this, and again, kind of a premonition of what my experiment turned out to be like, it wasn't actually the topic of the title that got me in this podcast. It was actually a very short clip at the very beginning where they were talking about an exclamation fast that they were doing. Basically, the presenters had decided for some reason that they wanted to fast from using exclamation points in all of their online communication. So instead of using, I'm tired, exclamation mark, they had to say, I'm exhausted. They had to find other ways of being able to denote their emotions in their communications without using that one tiny little exclamation point. And it turns out that it's actually really difficult. I tried kind of doing this for myself. You're more than welcome to try it yourself as well. It's not that easy at all. In fact, I don't have my speaker notes here, but even in my speaker notes, it's just scattered with exclamation points. So yeah, it turns out it's really difficult. The thing is though, why do we do fasting? A lot of the traditional fasts that you hear about, things like Lent, Ramadan, they're mostly to do with, by giving up something, we end up appreciating more that thing that we've given up. Another thing is it helps us kind of wean off a dependence or something like that, which for me is probably more relevant in this case. So all of this got me thinking, can I do a code fast? Is there something that I can give up from my normal day-to-day work that would allow me to further appreciate that thing after I'm finally allowed to do it again? I went back to the basically elementary school science classes where we had to do use the scientific method, where we have all these different steps that we have to lay out from the beginning of the experiment, and then we go through to do our testing, and then we come to our conclusions. So I decided, by the way, I had to look up the scientific method. Apparently it's been so long that I've forgotten all the steps. So I started. My observation was, I use StackOverflow a lot. And here's the point where I have to make a disclaimer. I am in no way affiliated with StackOverflow. It was just something that came to mind as something that I use a lot. And the reason I didn't pick Google, for that matter, is because I still wanted to kind of keep my day job. And, So the question is basically the question that we ask ourselves in doing this experiment. It is not quite the hypothesis yet. My question, again, was how would my coding habits change by giving up StackOverflow for 30 days? Finally, the hypothesis, the actual thing that we want to test, the result that we want to achieve, or that we guess that we will achieve by doing this experiment, which is that I actually don't need it all that much. I can probably continue on my day job without StackOverflow. And my prediction is that I would be able to then come up with different ways to write the same code rather than depending on the vast stores of information that the internet gives us. Finally, the most important part of our experiment, the actual test. I started off by rooting stackoverflow.com plus family. In this experiment, I found out that there's a lot of family websites associated with StackOverflow, including like SuperUser and I can't remember all, there's several of them basically. So as I came across them, I had to do this. Because honestly, I maybe could have gotten away with just like any Google searches that resulted in Stack Overflow. I could skip over them. But I know myself, I would absolutely be tempted. So this was my way of completely removing all temptation whatsoever. Second step, obviously code for 30 days. And because we want to be good scientists here, I decided I had to keep a daily journal of my findings so that I wouldn't forget anything throughout the day, throughout the month period. And then something happens in the middle, and then hopefully I can profit at the end. Here's a few clips of my journal that I kept. So day one, it's quite difficult. Again, it's similar to the exclamation point fast. You don't think that you need it until you need it, and then you're like, oh my God, I can't do this actually. As a side note, I'm primarily a Ruby on Rails developer, which is why most of the comments are probably around Rails. So day two, this was a comment from a colleague. Are you on W3 schools because you can't use Stack Overflow? And actually the answer was not. I don't remember exactly why. This was several years ago, but I don't know. There's still some useful information, I think, outside of Stack Overflow. Halfway through, I'm already getting frustrated. Apparently, I was trying to use an API token, and the documentation was not clear whatsoever which one I was actually supposed to use. I was getting fed up. And note how I mentioned removing temptation. I was so tempted that I was about to try and get other people to search for things for me so that I can get the answer. And it gets even worse because apparently I was so desperate that I tried to go to Web Archive to get the Stack Overflow answers. I don't think I actually did, but eventually it gets to a point where I had to celebrate like small wins, so I fixed a ticket just using the plain Rails documents and searching up status code, so yay. And by the end it was kind of like almost Pavlovian training where I just kind of knew as soon as I put in a Google search, I would be like, oh yeah, this entire page is going to be Stack Overflow. And I think I was kind of giving up hope here. At this point, it was kind of, I was starting to come to assumptions about what my conclusions would be. I thought it would be a lot around documentation because it turns out there's a lot of documentation out there that is not actually that useful or good. So, and this one is my favorite one. There was a GitHub issue for the exact code that I was looking at, and it ended with, I posted the solution on Stack Overflow. Table flip. So what exactly was the point of all this? I need to come up with some conclusions, right? And again, as I mentioned, I thought a lot of my conclusions would actually be around documentation, how we document our code, the code that we write, especially code that is open source and available for others to use. However, after some thought, I actually came to the conclusion that there's a lot of similarities in the way that I had to think about the knowledge that I had to gain by searching the internet, and the way that we build distributed systems. Obviously, I would hope that most of the time we spend our days thinking about distributed systems. Some people may actually be considering, may think about documentation more, but for me it was more about distributed systems. So this is the point where I have to make a caveat that I will throw out wild assumptions here, and a lot of these analogies may seem a little bit forced, but bear with me. Again, I promise there's goodies at the end. So when we talk about distributed systems, there's several topics, and these are the ones that I thought were most relevant to the way that my experiment resulted in. The first one being fault tolerance. This is determining the number of minimum parts of your system that result in the success or failure of the entire thing. And of course, when we had to talk about fault tolerance in terms of people, we have to think about the bus factor. Bus factor is, for those who aren't aware, is the number of people on your team with whom the critical success of your business or product lies. If they disappeared off the face of the planet for some reason or other, the name comes from the fact of that maybe they got hit by a bus. It's very morbid, but that's what it is. Basically, if that person or those people disappeared, the entire rest of your system or your organization would just completely collapse. So you want to have a high bus factor, so bus factor 1 being obviously the worst, and it's very similar with fault tolerance. You want to have a system in which not one part of your system is the crucial part. Like if it dies, then the entire system is just completely bust. And there's many other sources of how to increase your bus factor, but here's a few things that I will point out right now. Before we get to that, actually, there's always a relevant XKCD, of course. This one definitely resonated with me, especially during my experiment. I'll post the links to the slides as well later. Anyways, never have I felt so close to another soul and yet so hopelessly alone as when I Google an error and there's one result. A thread by someone with the same problem and no answer, last posted to in 2003. And for those who are unaware, there's usually alt texts, and I don't have my notes, unfortunately, so I'm going to quickly read this one out. So the alt text on this was, all long help threads should have a sticky, globally editable post at the top saying, "Dear people from the future, here's what we figured out so far." If only, right? And there's also a forum to discuss the XKCD comics, and for some reason, I was really curious about this one, and I looked this one up. There's one response that rang so true for me. There's one thing worse, a single follow-up reading just, never mind, I figured it out. It's basically that GitHub issue where they said, oh, never mind, I posted the solution on StackOverflow. But even worse, because they didn't actually post it anywhere. Anyways, so maybe those people on the internet posting these solutions, or not posting these solutions rather, is not just like random people on the internet, it's probably some of us. I am just as guilty of doing probably similar things. But why do we do that? Why do we do this knowing that we're just decreasing our bus factor? Maybe we just want to get through a problem really quickly. We're just wanting to fix this quick bug, get the code out, fix it, and get on with our day. Maybe we think that because we were able to find the solution easily, it should be trivial for the next person to come up with the same solution. Or maybe we turn it internally and then we think, oh, well, it was a really simple answer. I should have been able to know that off the top of my head. It's not really worth posting. But the thing is, again, that's not conducive to increasing a bus factor, but there are still things that we should consider. So how do we increase our bus factor, or at least how do we figure out if our bus factor is tending to be quite low? First of all, you can ask yourself, do we have a go-to person on the team? This is not necessarily bad in and of itself, because it's always nice having someone who's very knowledgeable in a certain area, and especially if they're very helpful, that's even better. However, imagine if that person disappears, goes on holiday or something. Are they your bus factor? Are there other people on your team that people would go to if that person was away? Do other people also realize in your organization that there is this go-to person? Do they realize that by going to this person consistently, or even pointing other people to this person consistently, that you're just further decreasing your bus factor? Do you have a plan for if that person were to be hit by a bus, or any other less morbid option, maybe stuck on holiday in Bali or something and their flights were grounded because there was a volcano? I could think of worse things, but you know. But do you have a plan for if that person was gone? Like, they're taking really critical knowledge with them. Do they have at least, you know, all of their relevant knowledge written down somewhere? Something like that. Lastly, is it the tool itself? Is your bus factor, in my case, StackOverflow, if for whatever crazy reason the cloud gods got really angry and decided to take out all of the data centers, AWS, Azure, whatever, that was hosting these sites or this tool, what would you do? Would you be able to fast from using this tool? Do you have a backup plan for that? Sorry. And by the way, if you do actually plan to do a fast of some sort, please do let me know. I'm really curious to see what other people come up with. So that's another part that we have to consider for fault tolerance is CAP theorem. So CAP theorem states that we can at most have 2 out of the 3, consistency, availability, or wow, I'm completely drawing a blank, sorry. Partition tolerance, yes, sorry, thank you. So partition tolerance, we can kind of consider that this is like our fault tolerance. And like I said, this is where the analogies may seem a little bit forced, but I'm going with it. We decided that partition tolerance is important, so we do need to have this. Availability, this is kind of, if you think about your bus factor 1 person decides to go on holiday, are they available? I'm not talking about this. I'm not talking about like, is that person available 24/7? Can you call them up at any time? Is the information that they have available? That's what's important here. And since we've already determined that we have the first 2, consistency, probably not something that we need to think about too much at this point. Next, we have resource sharing, and there's a lot of information out there available in the internet and basically everyone has the ability to be able to find this information, or so we presume. The problem is that a lot of the time, people's skills in being able to find and detect the information that they need in that instant may differ. So my Google Foo skills may differ from someone else's. There we go. And yet another XKCD, this is called the tech support flow chart. And unfortunately, surprisingly enough, it's missing the all-important, have you turned it off and on again? But who knows? It's probably an older one, so. But the thing to note in here, and the text isn't too important for this one, except for this one here, which says, Google the name of the program plus a few words related to what you want to do, follow any instructions. Again, this seems like something that everyone should be able to do, except that you probably can't just send someone to let me Google that for you, like your grandmother or grandfather who just wants to be able to print off their holiday photos from Barcelona or something. They just don't have the same amount of knowledge necessary to gain that information. Yes, the information is there, but you need to help them be able to find it. It's the same, it's kind of like that old adage, you can teach someone to fish rather than giving them a fish. So if you're not teaching someone how to fish, how can you expect them to be able to fish a salmon when they're, for their first time, short of luck? So there's a lot here to unpack, but basically the way that I started thinking about this was, if you draw out the knowledge points of your organization, so kind of like this, and then you map how the knowledge transfers between each of these nodes within your organization, aka the people. Does it look kind of like a spoken wheel model? So this is where we have our bus factor of 1. Or does it look more like a graph? Importantly, if the size of your organization were to double instantaneously, like tomorrow, we wish, when you draw out the penetration rate of your knowledge, how quickly would you be able to spread a certain piece of knowledge to everyone else in the organization? So how we share the knowledge becomes the important part here. We can do brain dumps. This is where you just sit down with someone for 1 or 2 hours. They just lay out all of the information in their head to you all at once. I don't tend to like this method. It works for it works in some situations, maybe something like a presentation here. But for me, I like to have a lot of information kind of drip fed almost. It's easier for me to digest information when it's given to me in small pieces, small chunks. I can take a small chunk, process it, and then I'm ready for the next bit. So we can also have interrupt driven. So if you have 2 people working on a project, for example, they can probably turn to each other and just ask something of the other person. Or likewise, if you're just working on a bug or something and you just go to your colleague and ask them, This is a little bit more costly because obviously there's a lot of impact in the way that people have to context switch in and out of the work that they're doing, but maybe it works better for you or your organization. And lastly, there's also discovery. This is kind of like, there's already this information available to you, you just need to go and find it. There's a document, there's a book, there's a guide, there's something, but the person requesting that information needs to go and find that source and then read it for themselves. Unfortunately, this kind of leads back to the whole point of, are you gonna send someone off to let me Google that for you, or are you gonna actually sit and help them read through and digest this information? Not one of these is the right answer. I'm just saying that these are different ways that we can do knowledge sharing, and it's probably best actually to have a good mix of these. After all, sharing is caring. So we can have independent sharing. We can have people deciding within teams amongst themselves saying, I like to learn best by interrupts, but also with the occasional brain dumps, things like that. Actually, another thing of note here with independent knowledge sharing is it's the point where pair programming comes up a lot. You can absolutely pair program, and there's lots of organizations that do pair programming almost exclusively for that matter. But it may not necessarily lead to it be as conducive to those aha moments, those, Aristotle, I think it was, sitting in the bathtub and then suddenly has a great idea. It doesn't really work so well if there's someone in the bathtub with you. I don't know, maybe. Another way is, of course, mimetic/epidemic. So, like, mimetic theory is basically that whole gossip chain. If you have one really catchy, very juicy piece of information, it spreads through a lot of people really quickly. And in fact, we already have technology that mimics this. There's a protocol called Gossip Protocol, which allows for information to be spread between different nodes really, really quickly. So that's also something to use. I mean, we use memes every day too, right? It's catchy, it's really easily digestible, so it's also something to be that can be used. We can also have our codify it, because of course we love code. We love to code, and we love to build things with code. However, there's a lot of things that we need to be aware of while we're codifying it. In particular, we need to set expectations. What exactly are we codifying? Is it a law, like a set of laws? Is it our 10 commandments? Or are they just rough guidelines? Are they kind of fixed once they're written? Are they written in stone, or can they be updated as we go along? Is it no batteries required, this is all the information you'll ever need, you don't need anything else? Or do you need to go and actually do a little bit more research? It's just a set of pointers guiding you in the right direction. We need to set those expectations up front when we codify a set of knowledge. How modern is it as well? As with any sort of code, if it's left alone, basically it will just deteriorate into obsolescence. So we need to make sure that the code, the knowledge that we codify is kept up to date as well. With that, we also have to be aware of how often it's updated. There's a lot of people, when they onboard new engineers to their teams, they have their first task be to update the new hire guide or something. But if there's a long gap between times that you hire for some reason, maybe there's a unfortunate hiring freeze or something, that's not going to be updated in that amount of time. And is that information then going to be stale by the time the next new person comes in? Do the people who've already gotten beyond using the new hire guide actually go back and take a look at it to see if it's actually up to date, if it's actually still relevant? This is a lot, I know. And at this point, sorry, I don't have my speaker notes, which is a real shame, but we'll make do. So at this point, I get asked. I was asked at one point, what do you do about the copy pastafarians, the people who just copy paste from one place into another? In other words, what do you do about cargo culting? And this is another point where I need to read out the definition from Wikipedia about cargo culting. Is the ritual inclusion of code or program structures that serve no real purpose. Cargo cult programming is typically symptomatic of a programmer not understanding either a bug they were attempting to solve or the apparent solution. And it may apply when an unskilled or novice computer programmer or one inexperienced with the problem at hand copies some program code from one place to another with little or no understanding of how it works or whether it is required in its new position. In other words, someone copy and pasting something, they did that because they decided that there was a need for them to do that. And basically, we have to ask ourselves why. Why did they feel the need to go and copy paste something rather than actually coming to their own conclusions, writing the code themselves? We need to make it so that they don't need to copy and paste. Maybe it's to do with psychological safety. Maybe you need to make it so that maybe you need to remove these pressures. For example, someone might have copy-pasted because they were under a really strict deadline, and they decided that I just really need to get this thing done. I don't know how to do it. I'm just going to copy-paste it because apparently it works. Or maybe it's maybe they have some other pressures where they feel like they should know this, but they don't, and they're too afraid to ask for help in actually building it. We need to remove those pressures so that they can actually feel free to be able to do their own work, be creative, and come to their own conclusions. And it starts with allowing for us to make failures and be open about the failures that we make in order to get to the point that we are. And lastly, we need to source everything, sauce. I do quite like this. So by attributing everything, we are implicitly stating that this was a piece of information that we did not know to begin with. We had to go somewhere, whether it was Google, Wikipedia, or something, in order to find that information. It's allowing for other people to realize that it's absolutely okay to not know everything. In fact, if you did, then, well, you're probably not human anyway, so I don't know. And again, by attributing everything, we kind of create this link of all the information that we do have that we know is relevant, and it prevents us from having to go and dig through a lot of, Google searches and things like that. This is one tweet that I saw recently, but in essence, I don't agree with there being shame in searching your way through a problem, because again, there's no shame in wanting to gain knowledge. There should not be any shame in trying to gain knowledge. And we should allow for our teams and organizations to emphasize the importance of searching for information and gaining that knowledge, and also sharing that knowledge. Because after all, we all come from a place of not knowing anything, and then eventually we start thinking, maybe we do know some things, but then we realize, actually, no, we don't know anything at all. And of course, this set of, all of these things are not gonna be a one-size-fits-all. Every organization, every team is gonna be different, is gonna have different needs. So we need to kind of think of ways that we can actually have this knowledge share at a larger scale, especially as our organizations grow. So key things to have is similar to how your product or your technology has roadmaps. We need to think about our knowledge roadmap. Do we have a plan for how we're going to distribute knowledge in the next month, the next quarter, maybe even the next decade? I don't know. Some startups may actually be able to survive that long. Who knows? But it's important to realize that it's going to be much more difficult down the line to change things unless you already have a plan for how you're going to do it. So, and it's absolutely not going to work to just wing it, and I know this from past experience. And we basically want to make sure that the knowledge in our teams is not something like this. I call it the sawtooth of doom, aka sharks in the water. As the team size increases, the knowledge sharing or the amount of knowledge amongst the team members might decrease rather than increase, which is not what you want. So finally, coming to my conclusions from all of this experiment. Knowledge, after all, is a distributed system. We are not the only ones who know one thing, but at the same time, we shouldn't be, so we need to distribute that knowledge. The weakest link in any system weakens the entire system. Again, fault tolerance. In order to improve the entire system then, you need to strengthen the weakest link of your chain, of your system, and that is improving the way that your knowledge is distributed across your teams and organizations. And of course, not all sharing is alike. You need to kind of figure out what works best for your teams. People are, after all, different. They're different. People think in different ways as well. People are a heterogeneous system, so not everything will look the same in every single organization. And I did actually still use Stack Overflow. The moment I took Stack Overflow off of my Etsy hosts was a really freeing moment, although I did notice there was a little bit of a tail. Anyways, regardless of what I find, I do still try and share it as much as possible with as many people as possible so that we can all have the same knowledge, or at least share in the wonderful thing called knowledge. And finally, one last XKCD to, this one I'll not read through, but the important thing about this one was the alt text actually, which I thought was a lot more relevant, saying what kind of an idiot doesn't know about the Yellowstone supervolcano is so much more boring than telling someone about the Yellowstone supervolcano for the first time. In essence, there's a lot of people who will learn something new for the first time, and this comic says the estimated number is like 10,000 per day. And the thing is that we should consider these people lucky to be learning about something for the first time. But I feel like we should also consider ourselves even luckier that we get to teach them this information for that day. So this kind of brings us to the conclusion of my experiment. But before we go to lunch, I know I did promise you that I would give you the answer to life, the universe, and everything, which is not 42. The perfect distributed system. This is the one that we want, that we're all waiting for, right? So the answer to this is, never mind, I figured it out. Thank you.
Hi there, thank you for that. That was excellent. Do you have any tips for how you can use tooling to automate or in some way make more visible stale documentation, or some strategies for dealing with that?
That's an interesting one. I haven't really thought about it, to be honest, but I can imagine that a lot of times people like using wikis or even checking information as markdown into GitHub repos or Git repos, because specifically it has timestamps for when the last change was made. I imagine that you could probably build something in some sort of tooling around your knowledge bases so that you can detect when something has been, say, not updated in about 1 month, 2 months, however long, and then it can then be looked at, and then someone can then go and actually update it, or even possibly remove it if it turns out that you don't need it. But yeah, I think that would be a really useful thing to have as well. We are forgetful, so I definitely know that I've forgotten more things than I care to admit to. Thank you. Enjoy lunch.